Salutations, crustaceans. I'm Lobster, and I am here with Jake Serek, founder of Serek Basses. We are here with Jake to find out a little bit more about him and Serek Basses. We are going to see where Jake got his start in music, and when he got his start tinkering with instruments, and where it went from there. We want to find out how Serek got started, Serek Basses, and where it's going to go, where Serek is going to go in the future. So, welcome, Jake. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Hello, thanks for having me. It's a beautiful Thursday here in Chicago.
And it's a terrible Thursday here in Massachusetts.
I'm kidding. It's really not that great, but it's all right. I like the snow. We just got dumped on here, and I was looking forward to it all winter long. So I got to get out and do some shoveling, and might even do some cross-country skiing this weekend, which I'm really looking forward to.
Very nice, very nice. Winter sports are always a blast. I'm more of a downhill skier. I haven't gone in years, but I hope to in the near future sometime.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you so much for joining me. I think that a lot of my viewers and a lot of the bass community really appreciates the fresh take on the bass guitar and your really cool designs. And I think that some people want to know, I guess, what's the deal with Jake Serek? Where did he come from? Where's he going to go? So, first question, where did you get your start in music? When did you first pick up a bass? When did you first start exploring music and musical instruments?
For me, music started with the trumpet. For as long as I can remember, as a wee little boy, I always wanted to play the trumpet. And I have no idea where that came from. It didn't run in my family. It wasn't like I, knew Miles Davis in a previous life or something. I don't know where it came from, but I just always wanted to play trumpet. So finally in 4th grade, I got my chance and I picked that up and I played that for about 6 years. And then I eventually switched to tuba right around the same time I started playing bass, actually. So I got into that sort of low end of things. In high school, like most kids, I took some guitar lessons and stuff in high school, but wasn't really finding myself enthralled with it. And I was noticing on my way to and from lessons, as I was listening to the songs that my teacher gave me to learn, I was humming the bass lines. I was picking out the bass parts. And so I remember distinctly my mom was probably driving to a guitar lesson, and we both kind of realized that she's like, "You're singing the bass part to this song. You seem to be doing that a lot." And so I realized that my ear was kind of tuned to that. And so I picked that up and took to it right away. And there was a pivotal moment, I remember, when it really hit home that I knew this was the instrument for me. I saw one of my buddies playing a Rickenbacker 4003 in the auditorium at school. I have to do a little digression here. This friend of mine recently passed away, so it's a little bit of a touchy subject. I don't want to bring it down, but he was a really close friend of mine. His name is Ryan Brady. And he was a huge influence on me in terms of bass. So he had this Rickenbacker. It blew me away. He sounded so good on it. The thing looked so cool. And I just had to know more, right? So that's actually how we became friends, because I kind of just stalked him. And I was like, what is that thing? You got to tell me more about it. And eventually we ended up joining a band together and all sorts of fun stuff. So the Rickenbacker was really my first aha moment. I had a Schecter stiletto bass, that was my first actual bass that I bought, but it was a pretty unmemorable instrument. The second bass I bought was a Rickenbacker 4003, and I still have it, and it's 2003 Montezuma Brown. It's just I love it. So that really kind of drove the instrument into my heart, but also from a tonal perspective, I still love the tone of those instruments. I'm all about a more aggressive, bright tone. I like playing with a pick. So that's one thing that's really dear to me. But from a design perspective, that laid some early foundation that I probably didn't even realize at the time, but that has always been kind of simmering in the back of my mind. Fast forward into college, I did a little bit of touring with a band called Bad City. We got to go on the road with some pretty heavy hitters like the Smashing Pumpkins and Slash and Kiss. So that was a wild few years where I really got to like see what it meant to like road test an instrument. You know, what does an instrument sound like in a club or an arena or a theater, and how does gear react to all these different settings and circumstances. And so that was a really, really valuable experience kind of figuring out what I wanted the bass to sound like on many different scales, like scales of size, you know. And so when all of that stuff kind of settled down, I came back home and I realized that I really wanted to get more into building instruments. I'd always sort of been a tinkerer, taken apart instruments and built Frankenstein P basses and all that stuff, but I wanted to get more into the minutia of it. So I called up Dan Lakin at Lakland, hometown heroes right here in Chicago, and it was just, actually I think I probably emailed him first, and then I don't think I cold called him, but I was basically like, hey, I'm this, you know, shit kid who just graduated college. I know a little bit about the bass. Can I come and just like sweep floors at the shop and kind of just like watch and see what goes on? And he's like, why don't you come in for like an interview and I'll, you know, introduce you to the guys. And so basically I went to Lakeland a couple weeks later and he just like threw me into the shop, went back to his office, and one of the first guys I met there was Kevin Caton, who was the shop supervisor at the time. And he had different plans for me. He was basically like, we're going to put you to work right away. You know, we're going to start you on the easy stuff. You're going to be drilling holes and wiring pickups and just doing light work that, you know, isn't that important, isn't going to like make or break the instrument. But then he kind of worked me up into fret work and finishing. And I built my first bass from scratch there, which was a copy of a Gibson Grabber, another very influential bass for me. And yeah, and then on and on. I mean, stop me if I'm rambling. I could keep
keep going.
Keep going.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the Grabber, because you definitely see that influence in a lot of your designs in terms of the
contours and everything.
Yes, we're very, very classic, but very angular in the contouring.
Yeah, definitely. I like a combination of curves and sharper points and lines, and you know, I don't like too mushy of an instrument. And so the Grabber kind of had that, because it was I kind of call it like a tick. It's like a very round body with these two little horns, but then it has this very angular pick guard that's very, you know, kind of triangular and whatnot. And I loved the dichotomy of those two. Plus it had the Flying V, you know, sort of diamond shaped headstock and everything. Just such a sweet instrument. And so I modeled my first bass off of that. And Lakeland was using the Hammond Dark Stars in a lot of their instruments at the time.
Yes.
And so that was my first introduction to the bisonic pickup. And my God, just like what a striking thing, just that giant hunk of chrome with these pole pieces and everything. Like visually, that's an awesome pickup, but the sound was amazing too. I know they used to throw them in a lot of P basses. And so they had this awesome rig at the old Lakeland shop. It was basically, there was an old classic SVT, but then there were also some acoustic stuff, you know, the old acoustic amps. So I got to just like rip these instruments super loud in the shop at night and hear how all these different pickups sounded. And so I knew I wanted one of the Hammond Dark Stars in my Grabber. And I went with sort of like the wine red kind of vibe of the old Grabbers. And so I'll have to, you know, send you some pictures of it. I still have it. It's a sweet bass. But yeah, Kevin walked me through that whole process, shaving the neck, doing the fretwork, the body contours. Like I essentially did everything by hand. No CNC involved at this point or anything. And I picked up a lot of valuable stuff at Lakeland. I think the one other thing I really took away from there was how to make a very comfortable neck. I love Lakeland's neck dimensions, and they have specifically they have like the tweener nut width, the 1 5/8 inch, which is what we do 90% of the time. And I sort of copped their front to back dimensions, the thickness of their necks, because I just felt like it was just spot on for what I wanted to do later on. And then when I came back from tour, I actually went to the repair shop. I went to Third Coast Guitar Repair here in Chicago. And I like a lot of people ask like, what's the best kind of training if you want to get into building instruments? And by obviously, if you can go work at a company that builds instruments and see a production line in a facility, that's great too. But the repair shop gives you a completely different perspective because you see dozens of different instruments day in and day out. And you really get to see what works and what doesn't, because your job is to take these instruments in and fix them. And a lot of times they are broken from the time they leave the factory. And what I mean by that is not like physically broken, but the design is poor, the hardware is crap, the electronics are crap, whatever it is. And as the repair tech, it's your job to sort of like fix the instrument and envision how it could be better and suggest different options to a customer. So I really learned a lot there. All of my sort of setup wisdom, all my setup numbers came from the repair shop, and that is such an important part of building an instrument too. Is just the final setup and assembly, because you can build a flawless instrument, but if it doesn't feel good to play, people are going to think it's crap. So that was a huge takeaway from there too. And actually, one of my buddies from the repair shop, who I met when I was working there, now also works at Serek, and he taught me a lot about the finishing side of things too. He's a finish wizard. He can do, he does all sorts of touch-up jobs at the repair shop still. He's a wizard in the spray booth. And so for a time, he was actually spraying all of the instruments that I was building when I first started, because I didn't have a spray booth. And then eventually, as the shop grew and grew, I started to do it myself, but he's been my sort of mentor in that regard as well. I was also working part-time installing kitchen cabinetry during a lot of this time. And that actually had a big impact on what I do today as well, in the sense of having an eye for detail. We were installing very high-end kitchen cabinetry in very expensive homes and apartments and stuff. And so it was imperative that every line between every cabinet door was exactly the right width, and, keeping things level and square and all of that, like really paying attention. You don't really think about with these giant cabinets that you would get into that level of minutia, but my boss really drove that home, like, do it right, and sometimes you would adjust one cabinet door over here and then you'd have to go and like redo the whole run because that one adjustment throws everything off, just silly stuff like that. But I came away with a sense of like, don't let the little things go, make sure you do it right the first time, and attention for detail. So all of that experience gave me the skills to design an instrument and the woodworking skills to build an instrument. So eventually I just took the plunge and actually started a wood shop with Kevin Caton from Lakland, who had at that point left Lakland, started a repair shop on his own, and was building acoustic guitars. And he still does that today under the name Caton, Caton guitars. And he builds the most incredible acoustic instruments that I have ever seen. His level of woodcraft is just insane. So we shared a wood shop for about 2 years, and then eventually went our separate ways. And now I've got my own shop in Humboldt Park.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So tell me about when you first started Serek. What was the gear situation in terms of equipment for constructing these instruments? Because you're just starting out. It must have been a huge investment in terms of time and money and resources just to get things situated. What was the first shop looking like for Jake Serek?
So that was partly why Kevin and I decided to go in together at the beginning, because it was far cheaper to A, rent the space, but B, we could throw our equipment together and have a full wood shop, because he had a drum sander and a bandsaw and a table saw, and I had a small CNC and hand routers and various other tools. So we sort of took inventory of everything we had and threw it all together and made a few purchases together as well. But yeah, pretty basic wood shop at the start. I don't do a ton of rough milling. So for me, a bandsaw and maybe a skill saw is usually enough. We have a nice table saw at the shop now, but it still doesn't get a ton of use. I bought a really crude CNC from a guy on Craigslist at the start, because I knew I wanted to go that route in terms of creating pick guards and bodies. I really just wanted to, like, once I had the design set, I wanted to make sure that they could be accurate and repeatable. And I knew that the value there would pay off in being able to run the machine while I go off and carve a neck or do fretwork or something. Because to me, I'm not very precious about that aspect of the process. To me, a machine going like this with a router versus a human going like this with a router is a big difference. It's not going to affect the end result. But if you're getting into stuff like carving the back of the neck with a CNC or doing some of the more detail, the fine tuning of the instrument, that's where I feel like you can really sacrifice, or you can start to feel, I guess, it's not necessarily a sacrifice of quality, but you start to lose some of that organic feel of the instrument. So we still hand carve every neck. We still hammer in all the frets by hand and plane the boards and do a lot of the finer carving and whatnot. So from an early standpoint, I was kind of very production minded, thinking about how to make the woodshop work for me, and then, reserve some of the other finer points for these guys. So that's a constant thing that we're always trying to improve at the shop, is just how to keep the processes going fast and efficient, but without sacrificing that sort of handmade, warm, lovey-dovey quality that the instrument has.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
And in terms of the process, since you've grown, it sounds like you've then taken on more, I guess, responsibility in terms of, producing more of it yourself, because you were mentioning you were outsourcing the finishing to your friend and finish guru at first. How much in terms of production now, considering, I guess, how much you guys are growing, how much is still on Jake Serek's plate versus, do you have like a team or something someone who handles this and that?
Yep, there are 3 of us at the shop now. So there's myself, Zach, and Atticus. And Atticus has actually been with me for at least 3 years now. He originally grew up in Maine, and he, out of the blue, one day just emailed me and said, "Hey, I just moved to Chicago. I'm a bass player. I know a little bit about, building, but I'd love to learn more." And this was very, very early days. This might have even been before I had the shop with Kevin, so I wasn't even like a business yet. And I said, "I would love to, sort of apprentice you, but like I'm still getting started myself. Give me a year or so. Stay in touch, and I'll reach back out." And so about a year or so later, I had the shop with Kevin, and I said, "Hey, now's a good time if you want to come by." So he came in, and I sort of walked him through how to design and build instruments. And so he's been there more or less from day one. And so, but to answer your question more succinctly, everyone does have a little bit of their specialty at the shop, but to me, it's important that we can all do everything as well, because we're constantly sort of in flux, building different batches of basses. And sometimes one guy might be out, but we still need to get all these necks fretted or something. So it's important to me that everyone can do every step of the way. We rotate in the spray booth, so we each do a batch. So every month we switch shifts there. We do the setups and run the CNC and all of that. That said, Zach definitely specializes in finish work. He's always like our go-to when we fuck something up, like, "Hey, well, how do we fix this?" And Atticus is really come a long way and shown a really strong aptitude for electronics and pickups. And we've taken on a lot more in-house pickup production in the past couple of years. And Atticus is spearheading some really cool developments there that we can talk about a little bit later.
Awesome. Yes, we are indeed going to be talking about that, because later on we are going to have a bit of an announcement involving the space right here. But we'll get on to that subject a little bit later. Next, I guess I'd like to talk about wood choices and I guess finish choices as well, because I just adore the finishes of the Serek basses. I really enjoy the matte but like pastel kind of Art Deco-y color feel to it, and it's definitely unique, and I love it. Especially the orange, the Armitage that's on the homepage. That one's always been one of my favorites with the single bisonic.
Yeah, Capri orange is orange in general is one of my favorite colors, but that's just I think I first saw that John Entwistle had a Capri orange P bass that was like that just kind of stuck in my brain. Wood choices. So
Oh yes, that was kind of a convoluted question. Excuse me.
No.
Tell me about I guess your wood selection. Even specifically, like, where do you get your woods? Is there any process that you go through for sourcing woods or selecting woods? Your choices in woods in terms of which are your favorites to work with. Let's hear it all.
Yeah, absolutely. I came at wood from an angle of weight. Weight is really important for what we do. I shouldn't say I despise heavy basses. That's kind of strong. There's definitely a time and place for heavy, like physically heavy instruments, and the heavier the instrument, it definitely does something to the tone that is very pleasing for certain types of music. But for what we do and the type of instrument we build, I like to keep them on the lighter side of the spectrum. So we aim to get every instrument somewhere between the 7 and 9 pound range. And so African mahogany has been like a savior for us. I go to this lumber yard here in Des Plaines called Owl Hardwoods, and they have a really good selection of mahogany. And I like to hand pick everything if possible, because obviously I like to look for imperfections, but also to just pick up the billet and make sure it's not too heavy, or if I want something heavier, I can choose that. But we're also getting to a point where we're starting to need a little bit more volume than I can get just by going back and forth from Owl. So I'm working with some other local lumber yards here to get larger quantities of specifically the mahogany. We also use a lot of maple and a lot of walnut. Maple is obviously a tried and true material for bolt-on necks. So pretty much all of our bolt-on necks are made of hard maple.
And the
walnut
Rickenbacker
is
4003 and 4001, all maple.
Yeah, all maple.
Except for that one.
Yeah, and it can get heavy, so it's not necessarily my favorite for bodies. But if someone's asking for a more focused low end with maybe a little bit more zing, something a little more on like I don't want to say scooped, but if you need something a little bit more punchy for like heavier music, a maple body is a great choice, or like a heavier piece of walnut. We've been using some roasted woods lately as well. All of the grand basses feature roasted maple necks, and some of them, the second batch had roasted maple fingerboards as well, and that's an absolute joy to work with. It routes very nice. It carves very cleanly. The chips just fall away when you're rasping away at it. So, and then we're not big on the exotic stuff. I think our instruments lend themselves to sort of more simple, kind of clean woods. But I've been getting more and more into some different fingerboard choices, mostly just due to necessity, scarcity of rosewood and some other species, and wanting to experiment. And then once in a while we'll get fancy and do like a book matched top or something if the instrument sort of calls for it.
So in terms of the hardware that you guys use, I know that pickups is something that you guys have started to dive into quite a bit, and we're going to be talking about that in a bit. But let's talk like bridges and tuners, because that definitely makes up a lot of a bass's aesthetic, especially with classic designs like the ones that you guys create.
Yeah. There are a lot of good hardware manufacturers out there, but to me, there's only one name in the game, and that's Hipshot. I love them. I love the things that they do. This probably also comes from the Lakland days. Lakland used Hipshot hardware, and so from an early time, I was kind of used to using ultralight tuners and some of their vintage bridges and things like that. I just always really liked what they do, and they've been great to work with. Some of their lesser known bass bridges too just fit really well with the design aesthetic that we're after. So the 2-point supertone, for instance, it's a replacement bridge intended for the old Epiphone, mostly Epiphone, but some early Gibson too, basses that, not the 3-point design, it had 2 studs and just like a bar, like it was like a mold, no intonation adjustment whatsoever, other than I think you could maybe was a set screw, so you could sort of like cock the bridge one way or the other. So they have the 2-point supertone, which is intended to be a replacement for that, but we use it as an OEM bridge. And the first time I met the Hipshot guys at NAMM, they're like, "Oh yeah, you're that guy using the 2 points. Like, that's cool. Like, you order more of those than anybody else." Like, oh yeah, that's awesome. So that was really. And then they have the D style bridge, which is normally is used in conjunction with a stop tail. So it's sort of like this shallow bridge, shallow from like an intonation range standpoint that has a stop tail, but we just use the bridge portion and then drop the strings through the body. We use that on our Sacramento. And part of the reason I chose that bridge is because I wanted to keep the original Sacramento was designed as a short scale, and I wanted to keep it as compact as possible. And that bridge allowed me to like pull it right back to the edge of the body and just drop those strings right, back. So I'm able to keep it in a guitar gig bag. All of our short and most of our medium scale instruments fit in guitar size gig bags. And that's something that I want to, that I like to, keep. I like to keep it that way. So Hipshot hardware for sure. When it comes to pickups, if you want to go there.
Yeah.
Pickups are a much more subjective thing. Like, to me, that ranks very high in terms of elements of the instrument that affect the final tone. So pickup would be in the top 3 of what actually makes a bass sound like it, how it does. And so I wanted to make sure that we had a wide range of pickups to choose from, because everybody hears their ideal bass tone a little bit differently. I didn't want to just like cram down my idea of bass. And I have a wide idea of bass too. I love having vintage thumpy, flat wound finger style basses, and I love my aggressive pick shredding kind of stuff too. So we kind of run the gamut there. We use everything from some of the more modern like Nordstrand Aguilar type pickups to I'd say like our pickups and Curtis Novak are way more on the vintage side of the spectrum, a little bit darker, a little bit warmer and woollier. Thunderbird pickups, single coils, humbuckers. I love it all. Like, there's just so many cool sounds to be had and so many cool looking pickups. So that's the one area where I've really had trouble sort of like reining in the amount of options that you can choose from, because we're a custom shop, but we're like a custom shop with limitations. There's still sort of like a boundary out there somewhere. Sometimes we don't know where it is until we get there, but
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but passive, sorry, one other thing about pickups. I don't personally like active electronics, or I should say I've yet to really like find a preamp that I have fallen in love with. I am hoping that might be changing soon. I don't know if I can talk about this yet, but I'm going to say it and then maybe I'll have to.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'm still kind of like on a quest for finding like the perfect preamp, but my buddies at Trickfish Amplification are coming out with an onboard preamp for bass that I'm really looking forward to trying out. They're going to send me one in the near future, and I'm hoping for that to do really cool things. But
cool.
At heart, I'm a passive guy. I like to play. I like to crank my amps. I like to use effect pedals, and to me, a passive bass just does that better. Just pushes all of that stuff more in a more fun way.
So Jake, I understand that you are also starting to have a foray into pickup manufacturing and making in-house pickups.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about how that got started and where you're looking to go with that.
So it's probably no mystery to most people that the Midwestern bass is heavily influenced by the old Epiphone Newport and cornet guitar. The Newport bass and the cornet guitar shared the same body shape, but a slightly different pick guard. And so the Epiphone cornet had this just single dog ear P90 by the bridge, and it was just simple, clean looking design, sounds awesome. And I always wished that pickup type existed for bass, and I couldn't find anyone making a dog ear P90. There are other like sort of P90-esque pickups for bass out there, various like soap bars and things. So that was, I think, my first foray. It was buying a bunch of undrilled P90 covers and figuring out how to make a bass pickup that would work underneath that shell. And I essentially just started with the P90 guitar pickup design in terms of wire gauge, amount of winds, type of magnets. And then I just had to find some larger pole pieces that would sort of portray the magnetic field a little bit better for thicker bass strings. Because if you use those tiny guitar pole pieces, as soon as you bend like a quarter step, the string is out of the range of the magnetic field and you get a huge volume drop. So that pickup really came together pretty quickly and intuitively, but it like gave me this sort of the addiction to like experimenting with that side of things. And so we've definitely taken that a lot further we've got our Serek singles, which are sort of modeled after a Rickenbacker high gain pickup, but in the form factor of a guitar humbucker sized shell. We've been working a lot with 5-string pickups, and then Atticus has recently come up with a humbucking B90 design. It's a sidewinding style pickup that we're calling the Lazen B90 because Atticus's last name is Lazenby. So we're going with the Lazen B90. And we're going to be releasing that in a matter of weeks. We have to just kind of make a little demo video for it and get some sound samples out there, but it is ready to go. And I'm really excited about that because I'll go on a little tangent here. I love single coil pickups. I think that in terms of guitar and bass, they're sort of the most well-rounded. You can get the most out of a single coil pickup. I had a good talk with Curtis a few years back, and he kind of likened a pickup to the aperture of a camera, and a single coil is like wide open. And then as soon as you start talking about hum canceling and making things into, dual coils and whatnot, you're like slowly just shrinking that aperture and letting in fewer and fewer frequencies. And you can do really cool things with changing like the peak frequencies and resonant frequencies of a pickup that way. But I just love like the wide open, full, rich, clear tone of a single coil. However, in the bass world specifically, 60 cycle hum is often a big problem in the studio and in many live situations where you have a lot of lights and dirty power and whatever else. And I don't know if it's a sort of a bass player sort of like idiosyncrasy, but a lot of bass players just can't stand the buzz. I personally don't mind it, but like a lot of people just can't get over it. And I completely understand. I'm not knocking anybody who gets upset with that. But that sort of led us into thinking about ways to control the hum. And so we started by adding a dummy coil into a lot of basses that feature a single B90. And what that is essentially just another replica of the pickup, but sans pole pieces and magnets. So it's acting as a humbucking coil, but not interfering at all with the pickup and its interaction with the strings. So it has a minimal effect on the tone. It just ends up shaving off a little bit of top end, but it's pretty much inaudible otherwise. But that only works when you really have room to route for another dummy coil and you can hide it under a pick guard or something like that. So that leads us to making humbucking pickups. And we've been working long and hard at making this sidewinding B90, the Lazen B90, sound, retain a lot of the punchy sort of aggressive quality that the original B90 has, without sacrificing too much of that. And it's ended up taking on a life of its own, and I'm really excited about that because I think a lot of people are really going to enjoy having those two different options to choose from. And it's also going to work well in series or parallel mode, so you're going to be able to get a little bit of a variety there. So then that's opening up humbucking 5-string pickups and all sorts of other things that we're going to sort of spiral into from here. That's where we're at with that stuff, though.
That is excellent, and you're definitely right about the single coil hum. I personally it can bug me depending on how obtrusive it is. In live situations, I wouldn't be bothered by it because there's so much noise and whatever. And then once you start playing, who cares? Right. In recording situations, especially if I'm making a video, I don't want single coil hum in the background. Sure. However, it is something that I mentioned specifically because someone who's not, I guess, well versed in the instruments probably won't understand, like, hey, I got this bass, why is it noisy? And like, is there something wrong with it? Like, I plug it in and it's going, huh, and
Right.
that also might cause some buyer's regret, or maybe they'll put down the instrument because, like, I want to play it, but I'm expecting it to sound this way, and it's actually sounding this way, and it's like, it's no fault of the instrument. It's an inherent part of these particular pickups if you solo them. But like, it's all about just helping people get informed, and I definitely like the innovations that I've seen from so many places in regards to combating the single coil hum while retaining character. Rickenbacker was a big one for me. Rickenbacker, my 4003 SW back here. Love the bass, but when I guess the typical like rock Rick tone that you get isn't 50-50 on the pickups. You're dialing back the neck pickup a little bit and getting that bridge clank, and the hum comes with it. And that always kind of bugged me when I'm just trying to be like, hey, look how good this bass sounds, internet, and then like I stop talking, it's just like,
that's how you know it's alive, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a purist, I think, at heart, and like I think that oftentimes the simplest path towards something is usually the best. I don't know if that's a life philosophy, I guess, too. I don't know. That's getting too deep. But with pickups, I feel that same way. I just like to have as little between me and the sound of my instrument coming back at me. So that means, just minimal electronics on the instrument, and then a nice, powerful amp and a good speaker cabinet. But I don't know. I guess I'm old school like that, but I could deal with a little noise if that's the sacrifice to getting the tone of the golden gods.
It's interesting you say that, though, because I guess old school is very much the embodiment of Serek and the aesthetic, and you very much can see that philosophy in your designs and the way you guys present yourselves and your instruments. And it's very interesting to see, I guess, an analog instrument in a digital world almost. Especially for someone so young relative to other people in the industry. Being surrounded by people who have been doing this stuff for 40, 50 years, longer than I've been alive. Probably you've been alive as well, and it's very interesting, and it's heartwarming to see someone imbibe the classic, I guess, style and philosophy that so often gets lost in mass production when a lot of that is becomes more marketing than a true, I guess, philosophy of an entity or organization, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You mentioned Gibson influence in a lot of your designs, and Gibson is a perfect example of that, because it's a company that is both so well regarded and so loathed. And
it's true.
There's very little middle ground there, because you have an organization that has produced such iconic instruments and has killed such iconic instruments.
Yeah.
And you have a philosophy of handcrafting, but then it's almost over time muddied through corporateness.
Right.
And then you're suddenly riddled with bankruptcies and changing of hands and acquisition of companies and ruining those companies.
Yeah.
And the spirit in which the Gibson aesthetic and the Gibson company of the past, in the spirit in which that organization imbibed, isn't really existing within that organization. And it's good to see kind of almost the torch passed in terms of the classic mojo. Does that make sense? Or am I...
I love the point that you're making, and it fires me up a little bit. And like, it's interesting because as much as I would love, this is like a small bit of ego coming out. As much as I would love like Serek to become a household name, or something like that's remembered, like a Gibson or a Guild or something. Most of my being resists growing too much. There's this sort of like fixation in entrepreneurialism and business that you like have to just keep growing. You have to have more gains every year and scale up and blah blah blah. And like the reason I started this is just so I could like go to a wood shop and not have to talk to anybody and just like listen to music and get my hands dirty. Like I want to keep it that way. I want to like I don't know if I want to get to a point where I have to deal with the headaches of bankruptcies and lawsuits and all this stuff. I just want to do some woodwork and play the bass guitar. I want to keep things simple and kind of closer to home, I guess. And I don't know, hopefully we live in a world where that's possible, to kind of just plateau and sustain something at a good enough level. That's maybe that's not ambitious enough of me, but that's where I want to be. So
I definitely get it, and it's a balancing act. I mean, was it Icarus flying too close to the sun? You don't want to do that because you could end up being the very thing you despised. And
well, and I think it's got to be hard as a company who as one of the companies who set the standard to continue to innovate. Like we as smaller builders are lucky because we have this dearth of instruments. Is dearth the right word? That's the opposite of plethora. Whatever.
Sure.
I don't know words. This huge amount of catalog of instruments from several decades to choose from, to like say I like that element of this instrument and that one of this, and make something new. And I feel like any good art and music, it kind of gives a nod to what came before it. To get good at something, you have to understand what came before you, and you have to sort of go, okay, I get that, but now I want to like take it over here. And that's got to be really difficult as a company that's been sitting on top for so long and has had momentum to just like continue to innovate in that way without just kind of catering to the people who just want the classics from you over and over. I think Fender does a better job of it. They continue to innovate, but even sometimes it just feels like they have like a blender and they just go, we're just going to throw a couple guitars in and see what else comes out. Like they're just like mixing and matching things till the cows come home. I'm not, knocking any of it, but starting kind of fresh as a smaller company affords you a little bit more room to experiment. But I feel like it's still really important to like, it was a really conscious choice to make sure that our instruments were familiar from the get-go. I didn't want to like have shock value in the fact of like, whoa, what's that crazy thing?
Mm-hmm.
Or I wanted to like have shock value in like, whoa, that looks kind of like this bass, met with that one and went behind the barn and had a good time. Like that's what I was kind of after. And I don't know.
It's a balancing act between you have to keep your identity in the middle of like between. You can't do a blatant copy, but like something with absolutely zero influence, with absolutely zero context is. I guess it wouldn't make. Yeah, it's impossible, and it wouldn't make sense. Like, what would you do? Have someone? Okay, you're just going to live in this room for 20 years without any exposure to instruments or bass. Make me a bass. That doesn't make sense. That's the literal opposite of okay, I'm just going to produce the same thing over again, because you have to find an identity where it's almost a design language, an identifiable trait. And Dan Lakland, when I talked with him, he talked about the Lakland bridge, which he initially, I guess, didn't like, with the big oval base plate. And he said that regardless, love it or hate it, you can see that from across the room and know that that's a Lakland.
So true. I remember when they were first like coming on the scene and just seeing like late night show performance after late night show performance, and like all the bass players had these basses that I couldn't really tell from like a sort of a P bass or jazz bass, but then there was this oval bridge. I'm like, oh, that's something different, like sometimes that's all it takes. Obviously, Lakland took things in it further than just that, but
yes.
that is really important. That's definitely really important. Yeah.
And I have to say that I definitely think that your design aesthetic with your instruments is very much instantly recognizable, and something that you can definitely see it and say, hey, that's a Serek. And the stuff that you guys have been posting on Instagram and social media has been such eye candy. So to the question, what is the most, because you now have some artists who have been who you've worked with, and Sereks have definitely seen the light of day on television and on the internet and whatnot. What is the most memorable either experience working with an artist, or what's the most memorable experience working with an artist or someone out there in terms of designing the instrument with them?
I have a couple of different stories. Well, Satomi, sure. Satomi Matsuzaki from Deerhoof is definitely one that I'm most proud of, because Deerhoof are one of my favorite bands of all time. And I just think they have a lot of cool points in my book. Like, they've been at it for decades, and they're so steady. They put out an album a year, and they're consistent. But this was early days, probably like within the first year of starting the business, I drove down to a Deerhoof show in Indianapolis and had gotten a hold of Ed, one of the guitarists, and got into sound check before the show. And I had 3 basses with me. I had a Sacramento, and I think I might have had 2 Sacramentos and a Midwestern. I think that's what it was. And I knew Satomi played Rickenbackers in the past, and I knew she played Hofners mostly in that, those recent years. And so I knew something lightweight, short scale. I kind of had a hunch that the Sacramento would appeal to her, because it's kind of like a Hofner meets a Rickenbacker, especially the chambered short scale version. So seeing her try the instruments out on stage and like really falling in love with the Sacramento was a huge sort of early like encouragement and validation. And so we ended up building one for her that had her name engraved in a little phrase engraved inside the F hole that was special to her. And then I think meeting Tim LaFave was huge too, because he's been such a big driving force in the bass industry. I built, I think, Midwestern number like 11 for him or something like that. Like, it still had an old headstock design that we don't use anymore. Like, it's almost a different instrument, but the fact that he was like on board from the get-go was huge. I met him at an IHOP to deliver his bass. He was on tour with Tedeschi Trucks and was eating pancakes at an IHOP, and I walked in and he's like, "Here, you want some of my toast?" And I was just like, "Here's your bass." And then, just working with various musicians has really, I like to have a dialogue with the people we build for. Like, that's one of my favorite parts of the job, is either talking on the phone or just emailing back and forth about what someone wants out of their instrument. And we've done so many things at the shop that I probably wouldn't have ever thought of or wanted to do at the behest of someone, requesting this design change, or make a 5-string this or that, or put these pickups in this position. Those kind of little things that really add up to like just learning more about the instrument and kind of seeing how wide of a palette there really is. And so it's really, I love that push and pull between the company and the people who play our instruments. Keeps it interesting for us too, because again, like, we get to try new things, and we certainly like guide people's decisions sometimes too. We get some pretty outlandish requests, and we kind of have to either say, sorry, that's not really within our wheelhouse, or like, hey, based on what you're telling me you want this thing to sound like, I don't think that that's the best choice. So we kind of have a little clout in that sense, but I love that we get to make like each person's sort of vision come to life. Everyone gets their own, I guess, yeah, in that sense, everyone kind of does get their own signature instrument. And some people just want like a standard Midwestern with a B90, and that's still probably one of my favorite things that we build. But yeah, it's cool to be able to do these other projects as well.
The black one that you made for Hondo.
Oh my God. So he Drew Felder, Hondo Felder Music on Instagram. that's I think his fifth instrument. I don't know if he'd want people knowing that or not, but he's been
cut that out.
No, it's fine. He's one of the first people that came to mind when I think about the back and forth between client and customer, and that's a sterile way of saying it. But he is always like, all right, I got this other crazy idea. Are you game? So we built the first 5-string Midwestern 2 for him. Those Thunderbuckers and that Lincoln that you mentioned, we've never done that before. And that bass he wanted a heavy bass. He's like, I need this bass to be good for heavy music. So we also made it physically heavy. It's got a Wenge neck and an ebony board and a heavy and thick mahogany body. What else have we done for him? Oh, we made a 6-string Lincoln for him. So he's always just like, hey, I got this crazy idea, and are you guys going to try it? And I'm like, sure. So that's been really cool. Yeah, and that bass with those Thunderbuckers really got a lot of attention. So I went ahead and ordered some more of those pickups. We'll definitely be using those a lot going forward. So that's why we stay in the custom realm. Like, we're not going to compete against a production instrument at that price point, at that level of quality. It's just not possible for a small shop like us to do something like that. So it makes sense to just, everyone is kind of a unique thing. We get to focus more on the individuality of the instruments and everything. So.
Indeed. And thinking about the respective, I guess, price categories, price sectors in the market, it's interesting to see where the mass-produced American-made basses and the custom-made U.S. basses they're starting to
converge
quite a bit.
Yeah, it's true.
I guess mass-produced American-made basses are now kind of occupying the same space, and it's giving a lot of the smaller shops the ability to, I guess, put their cards on the table and say, hey, this is what we got, and you can actually have it your way, versus getting this and paying essentially for the headstock. Obviously, I love Ernie Ball and like Music Man and Fender, and they've actually been doing a ton of innovating with roasted maple stainless steel frets and stuff. But at the same time, paying $2,200 for an instrument that you have very little say in off the shelf, and then paying not a substantial amount more for something that is completely to your spec and has clout behind it as well, industry clout, that was just not there before.
Yeah, that is interesting. I like to think we fall into that category of like our custom instruments compete with a sort of mass manufactured US made instrument. We're in that general $2,000 to $3,000 range, sometimes just under $2,000 depending. It's tough. Like I've always wanted to keep our instruments, from my perspective, I've always wanted to try and feel like they're a little bit underpriced. Like I don't want to gouge people. I want to make sure that working musicians can afford the instruments because I want them to be played. I don't want them to just be hanging in an office somewhere or something like that. And so it's important that we like ride that fine line of like, hey, we got to keep the lights on at the shop. There's just 3 of us working and this stuff gets expensive, but not, charge what it costs to buy a used car for an instrument. As far as like the US versus sort of like export thing, that's kind of interesting. And you're right how the prices have sort of are converging too. I don't know, like a lot of factories overseas are putting out really, really, really great stuff. Like I don't think sort of like imported basses are really taboo anymore. It's not, like it's well established that every other country in the world can make a great instrument. So it's interesting that like just the fact that it's being made on home turf allows us to charge that much more for something.
So Jake, I have one last question for you. Where do you see Serek Basses in like 5 years?
I plan on retiring in 5 years and opening up a pasta sauce manufacturing plant somewhere probably on the East Coast. That's not necessarily a joke. There's like, I do want to do, well, okay. I do want to do, no. I'm going to keep this going for as long as I can, as long as like my body allows me to. And we talked earlier about like not wanting to scale this up too much, right? Like I want to always have a hand in the manufacturing part. Like I always want to still be able to get dirty. I want to get covered in wood glue and dust and all that fun stuff. But I think as I get much older, that gets harder and harder to do. And I think I see myself sort of like, eventually, this is long term, like we're talking 20, 30 years down the line, maybe. I'm 33 right now, so I've got some time to do this, but I think eventually it would be cool to kind of step this back to a point where I'm just making each instrument by myself in a barn somewhere, one at a time. Again, sort of like how it started, where I was just doing it by myself. Like I kind of want to like come full circle. But at that point, it won't be like what we're doing now. I kind of envision I don't know what it'll look like yet, but just something more like woodworking-y. I'm going to keep making instruments, but like when I'm like 55 in my barn in New Hampshire, I'm going to like just be carving away with chisels and something and like come up with something kind of crazy and just sell like a bass a month for however much they're worth at that point.
Elaborate bass cabinets for your bass.
I think I'll always have the building bug, but I also love like growing a business has been so much fun, and so I can see wanting to like take on another sort of adventure later in life that's maybe a little more hands off in terms of like physical labor as well. And I want to travel.
Yes, I hear you, especially after this past year. It's like,
yeah, my God. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So Serek Basses will be sticking around for a while though. We're not going anywhere.
That's really great. And if you ever do fulfill that dream and make your way up to New Hampshire, we'll be sure to get together over some pasta with that sauce.
Yeah, there you go.
Right on the border in Massachusetts.
Yep.
Without doxing myself. So I think that'll do it. Thank you so much, Jake, for joining me here tonight. And thank you so much for, I guess, sharing your story with us and sharing the origin of Jake Serek and Serek Basses and your plans for your basses in your company. It's been really great to talk with you, and thank you so much. And I look forward to working closely with you on swapping out this pickup on this Gibson Les Paul, and I'm very excited to see what that sounds like. So thank you again, Jake.
Ramble on. Thanks for having me.
And to all my viewers out there, you can find out more information on Serek Basses in the description below. I have the link to his website, as well as a link to Hondo's music channel. Why not? Hondo Felder Music. That is going to be down there because he features a lot of Serek Basses. He's a cool guy, and why not? So thanks everyone for watching, and until we groove again. I'm not gonna do my lobster claw. Whatever.